The echo of Maya Johnson's heels against the polished floor of Riverside High's third-floor hallway was about to be drowned out by something far more violent. In 30 seconds, the newest English teacher at Cedar Falls' most prestigious public school would discover that her 8 years of kickboxing training hadn't been just about staying in shape. The camera phone in Kyle Martinez's pocket was already recording when Brandon Williams stepped directly into her path, his 6'2" frame blocking the stairwell exit completely. What happened next would shatter more than just the silence of after-school hours. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Maya had been at Riverside High for exactly 3 weeks, and each day felt like walking through a minefield blindfolded. The position teaching AP literature had seemed like a dream opportunity when she'd driven up from Atlanta, her Honda Civic packed with everything she owned, and her father's voice echoing in her ears about making something of herself. At 26, she was younger than most of the faculty, but her credentials were solid. Master's degree from Emory, student teaching awards, and a genuine passion for helping kids discover the power of words. What the interview panel hadn't mentioned was that Riverside High had its own unspoken hierarchy, and new teachers, especially young black women, weren't automatically granted respect. The first incident had been subtle. Brandon Williams, senior class president and star point guard destined for a Division I scholarship, had walked into her second period class 15 minutes late. When Maya politely asked him to take his seat, he'd looked her up and down with deliberate slowness before announcing to the room that he hadn't realized they were hiring kids to teach kids now. The class had erupted in nervous laughter. Maya had handled it professionally, redirecting the conversation to Langston Hughes, but she'd seen the calculation in Brandon's eyes. He was testing boundaries, seeing how far he could push before she pushed back. The incidents escalated gradually. Kyle Martinez, Brandon's constant companion and unofficial documentarian, started filming her during class under the pretense of taking notes. When she asked him to put the phone away, he'd claim he was recording her brilliant lectures to study later, his voice dripping with mock admiration. Derek Thompson, the quiet third member of their trio, would mumble comments just loud enough for nearby students to hear but soft enough that calling him out would make her seem paranoid. They were careful, strategic, never crossing lines that would trigger immediate disciplinary action. Maya's attempts to address the situation through proper channels had been frustrating. Principal Hayes, a well-meaning woman in her 50s, had listened sympathetically but suggested that Maya might be misinterpreting typical teenage behavior. The boys were good students from prominent families, Hayes explained. Brandon's father owned the largest car dealership in Cedar Falls, and his mother sat on the school board. Kyle's family had donated the new computer lab. Sometimes, Hayes suggested gently, young teachers needed time to develop thicker skin and better classroom management techniques. Ms. Jennifer Park, a veteran English teacher who'd been at Riverside for 20 years, had been more direct during a hushed conversation in the faculty lounge. "These boys have been untouchable since middle school," she'd warned. "Their parents donate, their sports teams win championships, and they know exactly how far they can push without facing real consequences. My advice," she'd said with tired eyes, "is to pick your battles carefully. Some fights aren't worth having." But Maya hadn't come this far to be intimidated into silence. Growing up in Atlanta's Bankhead neighborhood, she'd learned early that respect wasn't given freely, it was earned through strength and consistency. Her father, David Johnson, had worked in construction for 30 years, his hands permanently stained with evidence of honest labor. He'd raised Maya alone after her mother died when she was 12, and his lessons had been simple but powerful. Stand up straight, speak clearly, and never let anyone make you feel smaller than you are. When Maya had started college at Georgia State, feeling overwhelmed and out of place among students who'd attended private schools and summer camps, her father had scraped together money for kickboxing lessons. Not because he expected her to fight, but because he wanted her to know she could. Tank Washington's gym had been a converted warehouse near the airport, filled with heavy bags, speed bags, and the constant rhythm of gloves hitting leather. Tank himself was a former Marine who'd done 2 tours in Afghanistan before coming home to open Warrior's Den. He trained everyone from suburban soccer moms looking for cardio to at-risk kids who needed structure and discipline. Maya had started attending his classes 3 nights a week, initially drawn by the physical challenge but staying for the mental clarity. Tank had a philosophy about fighting that went beyond techniques and combinations. Real strength, he'd tell his students, isn't about hurting people. It's about knowing you can protect yourself and choosing when and how to use that knowledge. 8 years later, Maya's morning routine still included shadowboxing in her apartment, her body moving through combinations with fluid precision. The training had become meditation, a way to center herself before facing another day of subtle challenges and microaggressions. She'd never needed to use her skills in a real confrontation, and she'd hoped she never would. Teaching was supposed to be about inspiration and education, not physical confrontation. The breaking point came on a Thursday afternoon in October. Maya had stayed late to grade essays, the building mostly empty except for custodial staff and a few coaches whose teams had practice. She'd gathered her materials and headed for the stairwell, mind already shifting to her evening plans. Tank had texted earlier about a new training routine he wanted to show her, something about integrating more defensive combinations with counterattacks. The irony wasn't lost on her later. Brandon's voice cut through her thoughts like a blade. "Hey, Miss Johnson, wait up." She turned to see him approaching with Kyle and Derek flanking him like bodyguards. Their positioning was deliberate, blocking her access to both the main hallway and the stairwell exit. Kyle's phone was visible in his hand, red recording light already active. Brandon's smile was predatory as he stepped closer. Close enough that she could smell his expensive cologne mixed with something else, something that suggested he'd been experimenting with substances that would get most students suspended immediately. "We've been talking about you," he said, his voice carrying the casual cruelty of someone who'd never faced real consequences. "And we've decided you're not really Riverside material." The words that followed would replay in Maya's mind for weeks afterward, each syllable carefully chosen to wound while remaining just ambiguous enough to deny later. They questioned her qualifications, her appearance, her right to teach students who came from good families. The language was coded but unmistakable, designed to remind her that she was an outsider in their world. Kyle kept filming, his grin widening with each insult. Derek said nothing but positioned himself to block any escape route. Maya felt something shift inside her chest, a familiar sensation from her years training with Tank. Her breathing slowed, her stance automatically adjusted, and her hands found the ready position without conscious thought. The scared young woman who'd driven up from Atlanta 3 weeks ago was still there, but she wasn't alone anymore. Maya's training kicked in before her conscious mind could process what was happening. Tank's voice echoed in her memory from countless sessions at Warrior's Den, his gruff instructions becoming automatic responses. When Brandon stepped even closer, his chest almost touching hers as he whispered something particularly vile about her appearance, her body moved with 8 years of practiced precision. The first technique was a simple deflection, Tank's favorite for dealing with aggressive opponents who relied on intimidation rather than skill. As Brandon reached out to grab her shoulder, Maya's left hand swept upward in a smooth arc, redirecting his arm while her right foot shifted back into a fighting stance. The movement was so fluid that Brandon didn't immediately realize his grab had been neutralized. He blinked in confusion, his alcohol-influenced reflexes too slow to understand what had just happened. Kyle continued filming, his excitement building as he anticipated getting footage of their new teacher breaking down under pressure. Derek moved to block the stairwell more completely, assuming Maya would try to run. Neither of them had noticed the subtle change in her posture, the way her weight had shifted to the balls of her feet, or how her hands had moved into positions that looked casual but were actually defensive guards. Brandon's confusion quickly turned to anger. He wasn't accustomed to anyone, especially not a young black woman he viewed as beneath his social status, interfering with his intentions. His face flushed red as he lunged forward more aggressively, this time aiming to push Maya against the wall with both hands. The alcohol on his breath was stronger now, and Maya realized that whatever substances he'd been experimenting with had made him more unpredictable and dangerous than usual. Tank had spent years drilling defensive combinations into his students, emphasizing that real self-defense wasn't about flashy moves or complicated techniques. It was about using an attacker's momentum against them while creating opportunities to escape safely. When Brandon's hands came toward her chest, Maya executed a perfect parry and counter combination that would have made her instructor proud. Her left forearm swept Brandon's reaching arms aside, while her right hand shot forward in a short, sharp palm strike that caught him directly in the solar plexus. The technique was designed to wind an opponent rather than cause lasting damage, and it worked exactly as Tank had taught her. Brandon doubled over, gasping for air, his face cycling from red to pale as his diaphragm spasmed. Before Kyle or Derek could react, Maya had already repositioned herself. Tank's lessons on situational awareness had emphasized the importance of never focusing on just one threat when multiple opponents were present. Her peripheral vision tracked Derek's movement toward her, while her primary attention remained on Brandon, who was beginning to recover from the palm strike. Derek's approach was clumsy and overconfident. As the largest of the three boys, he'd probably relied on his size to intimidate others throughout his high school career. His reach for Maya's arm was telegraphed and slow, giving her plenty of time to execute the combination Tank had made her practice hundreds of times against larger opponents. Maya ducked under Derek's grabbing attempt and came up with a sharp uppercut to his midsection, followed immediately by a knee strike that caught him in the thigh, targeting the pressure point Tank had shown her for temporarily disabling an opponent's mobility. Derek stumbled backward, his leg giving out as the nerve strike took effect, and crashed into the lockers with a metallic bang that echoed through the empty hallway. Kyle had stopped filming, his mouth hanging open as he watched his two friends, both significantly larger than their intended victim, get systematically dismantled by techniques he'd never seen outside of martial arts movies. His hand shook as he tried to decide whether to help his friends or run for assistance. The decision was made for him when Brandon, having caught his breath, made one final desperate attempt to grab Maya. This time, Maya's response was the crown jewel of her training repertoire. Tank called it the reality check, Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. A combination designed to end confrontations definitively while minimizing the risk of serious injury to the attacker. As Brandon rushed forward, Maya sidestepped with perfect timing, grabbed his extended arm, and used his own momentum to send him sliding across the polished hallway floor. The technique was pure physics, leverage and timing rather than brute force, and Brandon ended up sprawled 15 feet away, his designer clothes torn and his pride completely shattered. The entire confrontation had lasted less than 40 seconds. Three teenage boys who'd spent weeks systematically harassing their new teacher now found themselves scattered across the hallway, breathing hard and staring at Maya with expressions of complete shock. She stood in the center of the space, her professional dress slightly wrinkled but otherwise undamaged, her breathing controlled and steady. Kyle's phone had captured everything from the moment Brandon made his first aggressive move. The footage clearly showed Maya defending herself against multiple attackers, her techniques precise and restrained. She'd used exactly the amount of force necessary to neutralize each threat without causing permanent harm, just as Tank had taught her. More importantly, the audio had recorded every word of the boys' harassment, their crude comments about her race and appearance, and their obvious intent to intimidate and potentially assault her. Maya's voice when she finally spoke was remarkably calm. "This ends now," she said, her eyes moving from Brandon to Derek to Kyle. "You will not speak to me, approach me, or interfere with my classes again. If you have concerns about my teaching, you can address them through proper channels with Principal Hayes. But this," she gestured to the scattered boys, "never happens again." Brandon struggled to his feet, his face a mixture of humiliation and rage. His carefully cultivated image as the untouchable golden boy of Riverside High had been destroyed in front of witnesses, and he could see his social dominance evaporating. "You can't do this," he stammered. "My father will have you fired. You attacked us unprovoked. We were just talking to you." Maya smiled, and there was something in that expression that reminded all three boys of predators they'd seen in nature documentaries. "Kyle," she said without taking her eyes off Brandon, "I assume you got all of that on video?" Kyle looked down at his phone, realizing for the first time that his compulsive need to document everything had just created evidence that would completely contradict any false narrative they might try to construct. The footage clearly showed who had initiated physical contact, who had been aggressive, and who had simply defended herself with remarkable skill and restraint. Derek was still leaning against the lockers, testing his injured leg gingerly. The nerve strike had been temporary, as Maya had intended, but the psychological impact was permanent. These three boys had built their high school careers on the assumption that their size, social status, and family connections made them untouchable. That assumption had just been thoroughly disproven by a first-year teacher who weighed maybe half what Derek did. Footsteps echoed from the main hallway as someone approached. Coach Rebecca Miller, who'd been working late in the gym office, had heard the commotion and come to investigate. She rounded the corner to find three of her basketball players scattered across the floor, breathing hard and staring at Maya Johnson with expressions she'd never seen on their faces before. Fear, respect, and something that might have been the beginning of actual maturity. "Everything okay here?" Coach Miller asked, though her experienced eyes were already reading the situation accurately. She'd coached teenage athletes for 15 years and could recognize the aftermath of a confrontation that hadn't gone according to someone's plan. Maya nodded, smoothing down her dress and picking up her bag from where she'd dropped it during the altercation. "Just a misunderstanding," she said diplomatically. "I believe these young men were just leaving." Brandon opened his mouth to protest, but Kyle grabbed his arm and shook his head sharply. The video evidence was damning, and any attempt to spin the story would only make things worse. Derek pushed himself off from the lockers and limped toward the stairwell, his limp more pronounced than necessary but his message clear. As the three boys made their retreat, Coach Miller moved closer to Maya. "Nice technique," she said quietly. "Marine Corps training?" Maya shook her head. "Kickboxing. 8 years at Warrior's Den with Tank Washington." Coach Miller's eyebrows rose. "Tank's a legend around here. Trained half the cops in the county before he retired from active duty." She paused, studying Maya with new appreciation. "Those boys have been running this school like their personal kingdom since freshman year. First time I've seen them back down from anything." Maya gathered her remaining papers and headed toward the stairwell. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, she was certain. Brandon's father would probably make calls, demanding meetings and threatening lawsuits. The story would spread through the school's social networks, gaining embellishments and distortions with each retelling. But something fundamental had shifted in the balance of power at Riverside High, and Maya suspected that shift was just the beginning of much larger changes to come. The phone call came at 6:47 the next morning, jarring Maya awake from dreams filled with echoing footsteps and the satisfying thud of defensive strikes finding their targets. Principal Hayes's voice carried a tension that immediately set Maya's nerves on edge, the usual pleasantries stripped away in favor of urgent administrative speak. "Maya, I need you in my office before first period," Hayes said without preamble. "We have a situation that requires immediate attention." Maya's stomach dropped as she recognized the tone. This wasn't a request for an early meeting about curriculum or student progress. This was the voice of an administrator who'd spent her night fielding angry phone calls from influential parents and was now tasked with damage control. Maya had heard similar tones before, during her student teaching when controversial topics had upset conservative families, but never directed at her with such barely contained stress. The drive to Riverside High felt longer than usual, October morning fog clinging to the windows of her Honda Civic like an omen. Maya's mind raced through possible scenarios, each one ending with her boxed belongings carried out to the parking lot. She'd known that defending herself would have consequences, but she'd hoped that the clear evidence of the boys' harassment might provide some protection. Tank's voice echoed in her memory from their conversations about conflict resolution. "Sometimes doing the right thing costs you everything," he'd said during one of their late-night talks at the gym. "The question isn't whether you'll pay a price. The question is whether you can live with yourself if you don't stand up." The parking lot buzzed with unusual early morning activity. Maya noticed several expensive cars clustered near the administrative entrance, vehicles she recognized as belonging to school board members and prominent community figures. A black Mercedes sedan dominated the visitor spaces, its vanity plates reading DEALR1 in bold letters. Robert Williams had arrived early to fight for his son's reputation. Inside the building, Maya could feel the shift in atmosphere immediately. Teachers who'd usually offered friendly morning greetings now avoided eye contact or provided tight, uncomfortable smiles. The custodial staff, who'd always been warm and welcoming, seemed to busy themselves with tasks that kept them from directly acknowledging her presence. Word had spread through the school's informal networks, and Maya realized that she'd become a topic of intense speculation and concern. Principal Hayes's office had been transformed into what looked like an emergency command center. Dr. Angela Foster, the stern, school board member who'd been notably absent from Maya's hiring interview, sat behind the desk in Hayes' usual chair. Hayes herself had been relegated to a side chair, her body language suggesting she'd been thoroughly displaced from her own authority. Robert Williams occupied the chair directly across from the desk, his expensive suit and confident posture broadcasting his expectation of favorable outcomes. Standing near the window was someone Maya didn't recognize. A tall woman in her 50s wearing a tailored navy blazer and carrying a leather portfolio that screamed legal professional. The woman's presence explained why the room felt more like a deposition than a school disciplinary meeting. Dr. Foster gestured for Maya to take the remaining chair, the gesture cold and formal. "Miss Johnson, thank you for coming in early. We have some serious concerns about yesterday's incident that require immediate address." Maya settled into her chair, consciously controlling her breathing the way Tank had taught her during sparring sessions. When opponents tried to intimidate her before matches began, she could feel the weight of their collective attention, the predetermined nature of this gathering, and the careful orchestration designed to make her feel overwhelmed and defensive. Robert Williams leaned forward, his voice carrying the practiced authority of someone accustomed to getting his way through a combination of wealth and social pressure. "My son came home last night traumatized by what happened in your hallway. Brandon has never been involved in any kind of violence, and frankly, we're struggling to understand how a trained fighter was hired to teach children without proper disclosure of her background." The woman by the window stepped forward, introducing herself as Patricia Reynolds, legal counsel retained by the Williams family to explore their options regarding the incident. Her presence transformed the meeting from an administrative discussion into something approaching a legal proceeding, and Maya realized that the stakes were higher than she'd initially understood. Dr. Foster opened a manila folder containing what appeared to be formal complaint documents. "Ms. Johnson, we've received serious allegations about your conduct yesterday. According to witness statements, you physically assaulted 3 students in an unprovoked attack that left one requiring medical attention and another with lasting trauma." Maya's training kept her expression neutral, but internally she felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that preceded physical confrontation. These people were constructing a narrative that bore no resemblance to the reality she'd experienced, and they were doing so with the confidence of individuals who'd never had their version of events seriously challenged. "I defended myself against harassment and physical assault," Maya replied calmly. "Kyle Martinez filmed the entire incident. The footage clearly shows who initiated physical contact and who was acting in self-defense." Reynolds smiled thinly, consulting her notes with theatrical precision. "We've reviewed the footage in question. While it does show some physical contact, it's important to note that teenagers often engage in playful behavior that adults might misinterpret. What's concerning is the disproportionate response from someone with significant martial arts training. The interpretation was so twisted that Maya felt momentarily disoriented. She'd watched Kyle's footage herself, seen Brandon's aggressive advances, and heard Derek's crude comments about her appearance. The idea that their behavior could be characterized as playful suggested a deliberate misreading of obvious evidence. Principal Hayes finally spoke, her voice carrying the weary tone of someone caught between competing pressures. "Maya, I need to understand why you didn't attempt to de-escalate the situation or seek help from other staff members. The boys maintain that they were simply trying to have a conversation about your teaching methods." The question revealed how thoroughly the narrative had been shaped before Maya ever entered the room. Hayes had seen the same footage, had access to the same evidence, but was now treating the boys' version of events as equally credible to the visual record of their harassment. Robert Williams produced his own folder, this one containing what appeared to be character references and academic records. Brandon is a National Honor Society member with a 3.8 GPA and college scholarships pending. He's never been in trouble, coaches youth basketball in his spare time, and comes from a family with deep roots in this community. The idea that he would randomly attack a teacher is frankly absurd. Maya recognized the strategy immediately. By emphasizing Brandon's achievements and social standing, Williams was creating a contrast designed to make her appear as the unstable outsider who disrupted their peaceful community. The fact that she was young, black, and new to Cedar Falls made her an easy target for suspicions about her character and motivations. Dr. Foster leaned back in her chair, her expression suggesting that decisions had already been made. Given the serious nature of these allegations and the need to ensure student safety, we're implementing immediate administrative leave pending a full investigation. The words hit Maya like a physical blow. Administrative leave was administrative speak for suspension, a way of removing her from the school while maintaining plausible deniability about prejudgment. She'd be barred from campus, unable to teach her students or defend herself through direct interaction with colleagues who might support her. Reynolds added her legal perspective with practiced efficiency. The Williams family is prepared to pursue all available remedies to ensure this type of incident doesn't recur. We're consulting with experts about the liability implications of employing individuals with extensive combat training in educational environments. Maya felt the walls closing in around her professional future. These people had constructed a fortress of legal threats, social pressure, and institutional authority designed to make her disappear quietly rather than risk further complications. The message was clear. Accept responsibility, resign gracefully, and avoid the prolonged battle that would drain her resources and destroy her reputation. Tank's philosophy about strength echoed in her mind as she surveyed the faces around her. Real power wasn't about avoiding conflict, he'd always taught. Real power was about recognizing when principles mattered more than personal comfort, when standing up was worth the cost of standing alone. "I'll need time to secure legal representation," Maya said finally, her voice steady despite the chaos swirling around her career. "And I'll be requesting copies of all documentation related to this investigation, including any communications between school officials and the families involved." The request shifted the energy in the room noticeably. Maya's calm insistence on proper procedures and legal protections suggested that she wasn't planning to disappear quietly, and the administrators exchanged glances that indicated this wasn't the outcome they'd anticipated. Dr. Foster's smile became more forced as she realized that their carefully orchestrated intimidation session had failed to achieve its primary objective. Maya Johnson wasn't going to accept their version of events or agree to a quiet resignation that would protect everyone's reputation except her own. As Maya gathered her things to leave, she knew that the real battle was just beginning. The physical confrontation in the hallway had lasted 40 seconds. The fight for her career and reputation would take much longer, and victory was far from guaranteed. Maya sat in her apartment staring at the official suspension letter, the words blurring together as exhaustion and frustration battled for dominance in her mind. The document used carefully neutral language to describe her administrative leave, but the underlying message was unmistakable. She was being treated as the aggressor in a situation where she'd been outnumbered and attacked. The irony wasn't lost on her that defending herself had somehow made her the problem that needed to be solved. Her phone buzzed with another unknown number, the fifth journalist to somehow obtain her contact information since news of the incident had begun spreading through local media networks. Maya had stopped answering calls from numbers she didn't recognize, after the third reporter had ambushed her with leading questions about her violent background and whether she felt martial arts training made her unsuitable for working with children. The apartment felt smaller than usual, the walls seeming to press in as Maya contemplated the destruction of everything she'd worked toward. Her teaching certificate, her student loans, her carefully planned career trajectory, all of it hanging in the balance because she'd refused to let 3 privileged teenagers continue their pattern of harassment without consequences. The unfairness of it burned in her chest like acid. When her phone rang again, Maya almost ignored it until she saw Tank's name on the screen. Robert Washington had been her anchor for 8 years, the one person who understood both her strength and her vulnerability. His voice, when she answered, carried the same steady calm that had guided her through countless training sessions. "I heard what happened," Tank said without preamble. Channel 7 ran a piece this morning about violence in schools. They didn't mention names, but described a teacher attacking students unprovoked. "I know damn well that's not how you operate." Maya felt tears threatening for the first time since the whole ordeal began. Tank's immediate faith in her character provided the validation she desperately needed after hours of being portrayed as unstable and dangerous. "They're trying to destroy me, Tank. The administration, the parents, they've already decided I'm guilty." Tank's response was immediate and decisive. "Not if I have anything to say about it. I'm driving up to Cedar Falls this afternoon. These people need to understand who they're dealing with." The prospect of Tank involving himself in her professional crisis both relieved and worried Maya. At 55, her mentor had built a respected reputation in the Atlanta martial arts community. But Cedar Falls operated according to different social rules. Tank's presence might provide credibility, or it might be dismissed as an outsider interfering in local business. 2 hours later, Tank's pickup truck pulled into Maya's apartment complex, the vehicle's dented exterior and faded Marine Corps bumper stickers, presenting a stark contrast to the luxury cars that dominated Riverside High's parking lot. Tank himself looked exactly as Maya remembered from their morning training sessions, his weathered face carrying the quiet confidence of someone who'd faced real dangers and emerged stronger. Tank listened without interruption as Maya recounted the entire incident, from weeks of escalating harassment to yesterday's confrontation and this morning's administrative ambush. His expression remained neutral throughout her account, but Maya could see the familiar tightening around his eyes that appeared when he was controlling anger. 8 years I've been training you, Tank said finally. Every technique you used yesterday we've practiced 1,000 times. Palm strike to solar plexus, nerve strike to the femoral, leverage throw using momentum. Textbook defensive combinations designed to neutralize threats without causing permanent damage. He paused, studying Maya's face. You did exactly what you were supposed to do. Tank's validation meant everything, but Maya knew that his opinion wouldn't carry weight with Dr. Foster or the school board. They don't care about proper technique or defensive theory. They see a black woman who hurt their golden boys and they want me gone. Tank's smile was grim but determined. Then they haven't met Robert Washington yet. Time to educate these folks about some realities they might not be considering. The next morning, Tank accompanied Maya to her meeting with the legal aid attorney she'd contacted through the state teachers union. Sarah Chen, a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s, had handled several cases involving educator rights and immediately grasped the complexities of Maya's situation. Her office was cramped and cluttered, a far cry from the polished legal presentation Patricia Reynolds had brought to the school board meeting. Sarah reviewed Kyle's footage with the practiced eye of someone who'd analyzed countless pieces of evidence. This is actually excellent documentation, she said, pausing the video at the moment Brandon made his first aggressive move. Clear verbal harassment, obvious physical intimidation, multiple aggressors. Your response was proportionate and defensive. Tank leaned forward from his position in the corner chair. Those techniques Maya used, I've been teaching them for 20 years. Every movement was designed to stop the attack while minimizing injury to the attackers. She could have done serious damage if she'd wanted to. Sarah's eyebrows rose as she studied Tank more carefully. What's your background, Mr. Washington? Tank's response was matter-of-fact, delivered without boasting or false modesty. 22 years Marine Corps, 2 tours Afghanistan, 1 Iraq. Certified instructor in multiple martial arts disciplines. Been running Warrior's Den for 15 years, trained law enforcement officers throughout the Southeast. Also consultant for the Georgia Department of Education on anti-bullying programs and self-defense curricula. Sarah stopped typing and stared at Tank with new attention. You consult for the State Education Department. Tank nodded, pulling a business card from his wallet. Started 5 years ago, after a series of incidents involving teacher safety. Georgia recognized that educators needed better training in conflict de-escalation and personal protection. I developed programs that balance professional boundaries with practical self-defense. Maya watched Sarah's expression shift as she processed this information. Tank's credentials weren't just impressive. They were directly relevant to educational environments and policy development. His expertise would carry significant weight in any formal proceedings about Maya's conduct. This changes the dynamic considerably, Sarah said, making notes rapidly. Mr. Washington, would you be willing to provide expert testimony about Ms. Johnson's training and the appropriateness of her response? Tank's answer was immediate. Absolutely, and I want to speak with the school administration directly. These people are making decisions based on ignorance about martial arts training and defensive tactics. Sarah arranged a conference call with Principal Hayes for that afternoon, explaining that Maya's legal representation wanted to provide additional context about the incident. Hayes agreed reluctantly, her voice carrying the weariness of someone who'd spent the morning fielding calls from angry school board members and concerned parents. When Tank introduced himself during the call, the change in Hayes' tone was immediately apparent. His credentials and professional affiliations transformed him from a potential troublemaker into someone whose opinions demanded serious consideration. Hayes had clearly done her research during the brief delay before the call, because she addressed Tank with the respectful formality reserved for genuine experts. "Mr. Washington, I appreciate your perspective, but we have serious concerns about employing individuals with extensive combat training in educational settings. Student safety has to be our primary consideration." Tank's response was measured and educational. "Principal Hayes, with respect, that concern suggests a fundamental misunderstanding of martial arts training. Maya's not a weapon that accidentally went off. She's a professional who used precisely calibrated defensive techniques when attacked by multiple students. The real safety issue is that those students felt entitled to physically assault a teacher without consequences." Hayes attempted to maintain the administration's position. The boys maintained they were simply trying to have a conversation about academic concerns. Tank's chuckle was devoid of humor. "I've reviewed the footage. That wasn't a conversation, it was a coordinated intimidation effort. 3 larger individuals cornering a smaller target, blocking escape routes, escalating to physical contact. In law enforcement training, we'd call that a textbook assault scenario." The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with Tank methodically dismantling every argument the administration had constructed to justify Maya's suspension. His expertise in both martial arts and educational consulting provided irrefutable context for Maya's actions, while his professional credentials made it impossible to dismiss his opinions as biased support for a friend. By the end of the call, Hayes had agreed to convene an emergency meeting with Dr. Foster and the school board to reconsider the administrative leave decision. Tank's involvement had shifted the entire framework of the discussion from a disciplinary issue to a potential liability problem for the school district. As they left Sarah's office, Maya felt something she hadn't experienced since the hallway confrontation: hope. Tank's presence had changed everything, providing not just moral support, but professional validation that would be difficult for the administration to ignore or discredit. Tank's final comment as they reached his truck crystallized the new reality they'd created. Sometimes people need to be reminded that strength isn't about intimidating others. Real strength is about standing up for what's right, even when the odds are stacked against you. Tomorrow they're going to learn exactly what that looks like. The emergency school board meeting was scheduled for the following Saturday morning at 9 o'clock. But by 8:30, the parking lot of Riverside High was already overflowing with vehicles. Maya sat in Tank's pickup truck, watching families stream toward the main entrance in clusters that clearly reflected the deep divisions this incident had created within the Cedar Falls community. She could identify the factions without needing introductions. The expensive SUVs and luxury sedans carried parents whose primary concern was protecting their children's college prospects and social standing, while the older cars and practical vehicles brought families who'd been waiting years for someone to finally address the toxic culture that had infected their school. Tank emerged from the driver's seat with the measured movements of someone who'd briefed generals and testified before congressional committees, his appearance commanding immediate respect from everyone who noticed his bearing. He dressed for the occasion in his best civilian clothes, but the way he carried himself left no doubt about his military background and professional credentials. Sarah Chen joined them from her own vehicle, her arms laden with boxes of documentation and legal precedents that would transform this meeting from a simple disciplinary hearing into something approaching a federal case review. The school's main conference room had been hastily reconfigured to accommodate the unprecedented attendance, with additional chairs arranged in rows that stretched back to the hallway entrance. Maya noticed immediately that the seating had naturally segregated itself according to allegiances and interests. Robert Williams sat in the front row with his expensive legal team, their positioning designed to project confidence and control over the proceedings. Behind them clustered the families whose children had benefited from the school's tendency to overlook misconduct when it involved socially prominent students. On the opposite side of the room, Maya was surprised to see faces she recognized from her brief tenure at Riverside High, but also many she'd never encountered before. Parents whose children she'd never taught sat beside students from her classes, their presence suggesting that her situation had resonated far beyond the immediate participants in the hallway incident. Most surprising of all was the presence of several current and former female teachers, women whose expressions carried the weight of their own untold stories about harassment and administrative indifference. Dr. Foster called the meeting to order with visible reluctance, her usual commanding presence noticeably diminished by the scope of attention this case had attracted. The formal agenda she'd prepared listed Maya's employment status as the primary item for discussion, but the packed room and multiple legal representatives made it clear that the proceedings would extend far beyond a simple personnel decision. Foster's opening remarks attempted to frame the meeting as a routine review of disciplinary procedures, but her nervous energy suggested she understood that much larger issues were about to be examined under an uncomfortable public spotlight. Sarah Chen's opening statement established the legal framework that would govern everything that followed, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd successfully litigated dozens of similar cases involving educator rights and institutional liability. She methodically outlined Maya's constitutional protections, the school district's obligations under federal anti-discrimination statutes, and the potential consequences of retaliating against an employee who'd been the victim of assault. Her presentation transformed the atmosphere from an administrative hearing to something resembling a federal court proceeding, complete with evidence protocols and witness testimony procedures. Tank's testimony began with his credentials, a recitation of military honors and professional certifications that immediately elevated his status from interested observer to expert witness, whose opinions would carry significant weight with any review board or legal proceeding. He'd brought his own presentation materials, including video demonstrations of the specific techniques Maya had employed, and comparative analysis showing how her response aligned with law enforcement training protocols for dealing with multiple attackers in confined spaces. Members of the board, Tank said, advancing to a slide showing force continuum charts used by police departments throughout Ohio, Maya Johnson's defensive response falls well within accepted parameters for protecting oneself against coordinated assault by multiple aggressors. Every technique she employed was designed to neutralize immediate threats while minimizing potential injury to her attackers. This represents textbook defensive behavior, not unprovoked aggression. His presentation included slow-motion analysis of Kyle's footage, highlighting specific moments that demonstrated Maya's restraint and professional application of defensive techniques. Tank's commentary revealed details that had been overlooked in previous viewings: how Maya had positioned herself to avoid being cornered, how she'd used minimal force necessary to neutralize each threat, and how she'd immediately disengaged once the immediate danger had passed. Robert Williams attempted to interrupt Tank's presentation with objections about the relevance of military training to educational environments, but Dr. Foster's legal advisor whispered urgently in her ear before she ruled that Tank's expertise was directly pertinent to evaluating the appropriateness of Maya's response. The ruling represented a significant victory for Maya's team and a clear indication that the administration's previous narrative was crumbling under expert scrutiny. Tank's presentation expanded to include broader context about violence in educational settings, drawing on his consulting work with the Georgia Department of Education and multiple school districts throughout the Southeast. His analysis revealed that Cedar Falls' approach to handling harassment and intimidation was not only ineffective, but actually increased the likelihood of serious incidents by failing to address problematic behavior before it escalated to physical confrontation. The real safety issue here, Tank explained, displaying statistics about educator victimization rates, isn't that Ms. Johnson possessed defensive skills. The real safety issue is that students at this school believed they could physically assault a teacher without facing meaningful consequences. That belief system creates an environment where violence becomes inevitable. Sarah Chen's follow-up presentation focused on the legal implications of the administration's response to Maya's situation, particularly the potential liability the district had created by treating a clear case of self-defense as employee misconduct. Her analysis included case law from similar situations, where school districts had faced substantial damages for retaliating against employees who'd been victimized by student violence. The first major revelation came when Sarah presented evidence that had been gathering quietly, while the administration focused on protecting Brandon Williams' reputation. Digital forensics experts working with the state attorney general's office had examined Kyle Martinez's devices as part of a broader investigation into potential criminal activity involving multiple students. What they'd discovered went far beyond the footage of Maya's hallway confrontation. Kyle's phone and social media accounts contained a horrifying archive of harassment material spanning several years, including hundreds of photos and videos of female students taken without their consent, many in states of undress or during vulnerable moments. the investigation had revealed a systematic network of male students who competed to obtain compromising images of their female classmates, with Brandon Williams and Kyle Martinez serving as central figures in this operation. The revelation sent shockwaves through the assembled parents and school officials, many of whom were learning for the first time about the scope of predatory behavior that had been operating within their school community. Several families in the Williams section of the room began gathering their belongings and leaving through the back exit, their departure suggesting they were reconsidering their associations with the accused students and their families. Tank's presentation continued with documentation showing how the harassment network had specifically targeted vulnerable students, including those with documented disabilities, learning differences, and economic disadvantages. The pattern revealed a calculated approach to victimization that went far beyond typical teenage misconduct into territory that law enforcement classified as organized criminal activity. Dr. Foster attempted to regain control of the narrative by questioning the relevance of these broader allegations to Maya's specific employment situation, but Sarah Chen's response was swift and devastating. Dr. Foster, these allegations are directly relevant because they establish the context in which Ms. Johnson was operating. She wasn't dealing with isolated teenage misbehavior. She was confronting members of an organized harassment network that had been operating with impunity for years. The testimony phase of the meeting began with Principal Hayes providing her account of the events leading up to Maya's suspension, but her presentation was repeatedly interrupted by questions from board members who were clearly troubled by the administration's handling of the situation. Hayes' attempts to characterize the boys' behavior as normal teenage conduct were systematically undermined by the digital evidence and expert testimony that had already been presented. Rebecca Miller, the girls' basketball coach, provided crucial testimony about her observations of the school's social dynamics and the systematic intimidation that had been targeting female students and staff for several years. Her account was particularly damaging to the administration's position because she documented multiple incidents that had been reported to school officials but dismissed as typical adolescent drama or misunderstandings. "I've been coaching teenage athletes for 15 years, Miller testified, her voice carrying the frustration of someone who'd watched preventable problems escalate due to administrative indifference. "I know the difference between normal teenage behavior and predatory conduct. What I witnessed in this school was a pattern of systematic harassment that created an environment where female students and staff were afraid to report misconduct because they knew it would be minimized or ignored." The most powerful testimony came from students themselves, beginning with Amanda Rodriguez, a senior whose academic achievements had made her a target for harassment by students who resented her success. Amanda's account revealed that the intimidation tactics used against Maya were part of a broader strategy designed to silence anyone who might challenge the social hierarchy that protected certain students from consequences for their actions. "When I saw Ms. Johnson defend herself," Amanda testified, her voice growing stronger as she continued, "I realized that we didn't have to accept this treatment as normal. I'd been afraid to speak up because Tyler Harrison and his friends had made it clear that reporting them would only make things worse for us. But seeing someone finally stand up to them showed me that we had more power than we realized." Jennifer Park, daughter of the veteran English teacher who'd warned Maya about picking battles carefully, provided devastating testimony about the administration's pattern of protecting certain students while failing to support staff members who reported misconduct. Her account included specific incidents where teachers had faced retaliation for attempting to hold socially prominent students accountable for their behavior. Marcus Thompson, whose decision to testify had surprised everyone who knew him as a quiet student who typically avoided controversy, provided the most damaging evidence of all. His testimony revealed the existence of a sophisticated network for sharing and trading compromising images of female students, with participation extending far beyond the 3 boys who'd confronted Maya in the hallway. "They called it the collection," Marcus explained, his voice barely audible as he described the systematic exploitation that had been operating within the school community. Points for different types of pictures, bonuses for videos, extra credit for getting images of specific targets they considered challenging. It wasn't just about the pictures themselves. It was about power and control, about proving they could humiliate anyone they wanted without facing consequences. Marcus's testimony included details about how the network had specifically targeted female teachers, with Maya being their most recent focus due to her youth and perceived vulnerability as a new faculty member. The revelation that her harassment had been part of a coordinated campaign rather than spontaneous student misbehavior fundamentally changed the legal and ethical framework for evaluating the entire situation. Robert Williams was on his feet before Marcus finished speaking, his face cycling through emotions as he processed the implications of what was being revealed about his son's activities. "These are unsubstantiated allegations from children who are trying to protect a teacher who violently assaulted my son," he declared, his voice carrying the desperation of someone who felt control slipping away. "This is exactly the kind of character assassination we expected once this situation became public." Tank's response was measured but devastating, delivered with the authority of someone who'd briefed senior military commanders on complex operational failures. "Mr. Williams, these aren't allegations. The digital forensics team from the Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation has recovered over 300 images and videos obtained without consent, plus text message chains documenting distribution and sale of such material. Your son's participation in this network is thoroughly documented through metadata analysis and communication records." The silence that followed Tank's announcement was absolute, broken only by the sound of several parents gathering their belongings and leaving the meeting. Maya watched Robert Williams' face as he processed the magnitude of what his family was facing, his previous confidence evaporating as the scope of the criminal investigation became clear. Dr. Foster's voice was barely audible when she finally spoke. The board was not informed about any involvement by the Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation. Sarah Chin's smile was thin but triumphant as she opened her briefcase and withdrew a thick folder containing official documentation. The warrant was executed Thursday evening after the State Attorney General's office reviewed the initial evidence. Given the serious nature of the potential charges, including distribution of child pornography, conspiracy to commit sexual harassment, and organized exploitation of minors, the state has assumed primary jurisdiction over the criminal investigation. The revelation that state authorities were already building criminal cases against the students involved fundamentally altered the dynamics of the school board meeting. What had begun as a disciplinary hearing about teacher conduct had transformed into a discussion about the district's liability for failing to prevent and address systematic criminal activity within their facilities. Tank continued his presentation with evidence showing how the harassment network had evolved over several years, becoming increasingly sophisticated in its targeting strategies and distribution methods. His analysis revealed that the organization had been studying their victims' vulnerabilities and tailoring their approaches to maximize psychological impact while minimizing the risk of meaningful retaliation. "This wasn't random teenage misbehavior," Tank explained, displaying communication logs that had been recovered during the investigation. "This was organized predatory behavior that had been operating with the implicit protection of an administration that consistently minimized complaints and failed to investigate patterns of misconduct involving certain students." The testimony phase continued with accounts from other female teachers who'd experienced harassment but had been afraid to report it due to the administration's track record of protecting socially prominent students. These educators described a pattern of subtle retaliation against staff members who challenged student misconduct, including scheduling changes, committee assignments, and performance evaluations that seemed designed to discourage assertiveness. Ms. Jennifer Park, the veteran teacher who'd warned Maya about the political realities of Riverside High, provided particularly damaging testimony about the administration's response to previous incidents involving the same group of students. Her detailed documentation revealed that complaints about Brandon Williams, Kyle Martinez, and Derek Thompson had been consistently minimized or attributed to misunderstandings rather than investigated as potential misconduct. "I've kept detailed records for 5 years, Park testified, referring to a thick binder she'd brought to the meeting. "Every incident, every complaint, every administrative response that failed to address the underlying problems. The pattern is clear. Certain students received protection from consequences, while their victims were blamed for creating drama or failing to handle normal teenage behavior appropriately." The board's questions for Park revealed their growing concern about the district's potential liability for failing to address documented patterns of harassment and intimidation. Several members seemed particularly troubled by evidence that complaints about sexual harassment had been characterized as personality conflicts or misunderstandings rather than investigated according to federal guidelines. Tank's presentation expanded to include analysis of similar cases from other school districts, showing how failure to address systematic harassment networks had resulted in substantial federal investigations and financial penalties. His expertise in educational consulting provided the board with a clear understanding of the legal and regulatory framework they were operating within, and the potential consequences of their decisions about Maya's employment status. "The district has an opportunity here," Tank explained, displaying case studies from successful intervention programs he'd helped implement in other communities. "This situation can become the catalyst for creating a safer, more respectful environment for everyone, or it can become the foundation for years of legal challenges and federal oversight. The choice is entirely up to the leadership in this room." Sarah Chen's presentation of legal precedents made it clear that Maya's case had attracted attention from federal civil rights organizations who were monitoring the situation for potential discrimination and retaliation issues. Several prominent legal advocacy groups had already contacted her office expressing interest in supporting Maya's case if the school district continued to treat her defensive actions as employee misconduct. The testimony from students continued with accounts that painted an increasingly comprehensive picture of the toxic environment that had developed at Riverside High under the previous administration's approach to discipline and student accountability. Student after student described incidents where reporting harassment or misconduct had resulted in social retaliation rather than protection or resolution. A particularly powerful testimony came from Lisa Chen, a junior whose academic success had made her a target for the harassment network. Her account revealed how the group had used sophisticated psychological manipulation techniques to isolate their victims and discourage them from seeking help or support from adults who might intervene on their behalf. "They were very careful about how they operated," Lisa explained, her voice steady despite the obvious emotional difficulty of sharing her experiences. "They studied us, learned our weaknesses and insecurities, then used that information to make us feel like we deserved what was happening to us. They convinced us that reporting them would only make things worse, and for a long time, that seemed to be true." Lisa's testimony included specific examples of how the administration had responded to her attempts to report harassment, including suggestions that she might be overreacting to normal social dynamics or misinterpreting friendly behavior as threatening. Her documentation revealed a pattern of victim blaming that had effectively silenced multiple students who had attempted to seek help through official channels. Tank's analysis of Lisa's testimony provided crucial context about the psychological impact of systematic harassment and the long-term consequences for victims who don't receive appropriate support from institutional authorities. His presentation included research data showing how failure to address harassment networks typically resulted in escalating misconduct that eventually crossed into criminal territory. "What we're seeing here is a textbook example of institutional failure," Tank explained, displaying organizational charts that showed how the administration's approach had created conditions that enabled predatory behavior to flourish unchecked. "When students learn that certain individuals are protected from consequences regardless of their actions, it creates an environment where violence and exploitation become inevitable outcomes." The board's deliberations were interrupted by the arrival of additional documentation that Sarah Chen had requested from the State Attorney General's office. The new evidence included preliminary findings from the digital forensics investigation that revealed the scope of the harassment network extended far beyond Riverside High into other schools within the district and neighboring communities. Dr. Foster's visible shock at this revelation suggested that the administration had been completely unaware of the criminal investigation that had been developing parallel to their disciplinary proceedings. The state's evidence included communications showing that the harassment network had been actively recruiting participants from multiple schools and had developed sophisticated methods for avoiding detection by school authorities. Tank's presentation of this new evidence provided devastating context for understanding why Maya's confrontation with Brandon Williams and his associates had been inevitable. The network had been escalating its activities over several years, becoming increasingly bold in their targeting of authority figures who might pose a threat to their operations. "Ms. Johnson wasn't randomly selected for harassment," Tank explained, displaying communication logs that showed the group had specifically identified her as a priority target due to her youth, inexperience, and potential vulnerability as a new faculty member. This was a calculated effort to test whether they could successfully intimidate and silence someone in a position of authority. The revelation that Maya had been specifically targeted as part of a broader campaign to test the network's power fundamentally altered the legal and ethical framework for evaluating her response to the hallway confrontation. Rather than being an isolated incident of student misconduct, the attack represented an escalation in organized criminal activity that posed serious threats to the safety and integrity of the educational environment. Sarah Chen's analysis of the legal implications made it clear that the school district's treatment of Maya, as the aggressor in this situation, had created substantial liability under federal civil rights statutes. Her presentation included documentation showing that similar cases had resulted in multi-million-dollar settlements when school districts had retaliated against employees who'd been victimized by systematic harassment. The board's questions for Sarah revealed their growing understanding of the potential consequences of their previous decisions regarding Maya's employment status. Several members seemed particularly concerned about the possibility of federal investigation and oversight if they continued to treat Maya's defensive actions as employee misconduct rather than appropriate response to criminal assault. Tank's final presentation included recommendations for systematic changes that would address the underlying problems that had created conditions for the harassment network to operate. His proposals drew on his experience implementing successful intervention programs in other educational communities, providing the board with concrete steps they could take to prevent similar situations from developing in the future. Real change requires more than just disciplining the individuals who got caught, Tank explained, displaying implementation timelines for comprehensive anti-harassment programs. It requires creating an institutional culture where reporting misconduct is supported rather than punished, where victims receive protection rather than blame, and where prevention is prioritized over damage control. The student testimony concluded with accounts from several young women who'd found the courage to speak up only after seeing Maya defend herself against her attackers. Their stories revealed that Maya's actions had created a ripple effect throughout the school community, inspiring other victims to break their silence and seek support for harassment they'd previously endured alone. Maya found her voice for the first time during the proceedings, standing to address the board directly with words that carried the weight of everything she'd experienced since arriving in Cedar Falls. When I accepted the position at Riverside High, I wanted to inspire students to find their voices through literature and critical thinking. I never expected to become a symbol of resistance against harassment and abuse. Her statement continued with reflections on the broader implications of her experience and the responsibility she felt to other educators and students who might face similar challenges. If my willingness to defend myself helps create an environment where other victims feel safe to speak up, then perhaps something positive can emerge from this traumatic situation. Maya's words triggered an unexpected response from the audience, with students throughout the room standing to show their support for her message and their appreciation for the courage she'd demonstrated. The spontaneous demonstration of solidarity clearly moved several board members and provided powerful visual evidence of the positive impact Maya's actions had created within the school community. The board's deliberations lasted over 4 hours, with multiple recesses as they consulted with legal advisors and reviewed the extensive documentation that had been presented during the testimony phase. When they finally returned to announce their decisions, Dr. Foster's expression reflected the gravity of the situation and the magnitude of the changes that would be required to address the problems that had been revealed. The board finds that Maya Johnson acted appropriately and lawfully in defending herself against assault by multiple students, Dr. Foster announced, her voice carrying the weight of institutional recognition that had been long overdue. Her administrative leave is immediately terminated, and she will be reinstated with full back pay, benefits, and a formal apology from the district for our initial response to this incident. The room erupted in sustained applause from the students and parents who'd supported Maya throughout the proceedings, but Dr. Foster's announcement was far from complete. The board's decisions extended far beyond Maya's individual case to address the systematic problems that had been exposed during the investigation. The board also announces immediate implementation of comprehensive anti-harassment training for all staff and students, mandatory reporting protocols for suspected abuse, establishment of an anonymous reporting system for students who experience harassment or intimidation, and partnership with outside experts to conduct a complete review of our disciplinary policies and procedures. The comprehensive nature of the board's response reflected their understanding that cosmetic changes would be insufficient to address the deeply rooted problems that had been operating within their educational community. The commitment to outside oversight and systematic reform suggested that Maya's experience had catalyzed institutional changes that would have lasting impact far beyond her individual situation. Dr. Foster's final announcement addressed the criminal investigation that had been proceeding parallel to the school board's deliberations. The district will provide full cooperation with state and federal authorities investigating criminal activity within our schools, and we commit to implementing any additional reforms that may be recommended as a result of those investigations." Maya felt tears streaming down her face as the weight of vindication finally settled over her consciousness. The months of uncertainty, professional limbo, and community hostility had culminated in not just personal redemption but systematic change that would protect future students and educators from the harassment she'd experienced. Tang's hand on her shoulder provided steady support as she processed the magnitude of what had been accomplished through their collective efforts. She'd been prepared for a prolonged legal battle that might have ended her teaching career and depleted her financial resources. Instead, her willingness to defend herself had become the catalyst for institutional transformation that addressed problems extending far beyond her individual experience. Robert Williams and his legal team departed the meeting without speaking to the media representatives who'd gathered outside the school building, their silence providing eloquent testimony about the collapse of their strategy to discredit Maya and protect Brandon from the consequences of his actions. Within days, news reports would reveal that Brandon, Kyle, and Derek were facing serious criminal charges that would follow them far beyond their high school years. Maya returned to her classroom the following Monday to find it transformed by welcome-back decorations created by students she'd never taught. Clear evidence that word of her vindication had spread throughout the school community over the weekend. Students who'd previously been afraid to associate with her now openly expressed their support and admiration for her courage in standing up to systematic harassment. The atmosphere within Riverside High underwent dramatic transformation in the weeks following the board meeting, as students and staff adapted to new policies and procedures designed to prevent harassment and support victims who reported misconduct. The anonymous reporting system generated dozens of complaints in its first month of operation, revealing the scope of problems that had been festering unaddressed under the previous administrative approach. Maya's classes became forums for discussions about power, justice, and finding voice through literature that resonated deeply with students' lived experiences of inequality and institutional indifference. Her AP literature curriculum incorporated works by authors who'd faced oppression and found strength through self-expression and resistance, creating connections between academic content and contemporary social justice issues. Tank's involvement with the school district extended far beyond Maya's individual case, as his expertise in conflict resolution and violence prevention made him a valuable consultant for implementing the systematic reforms the board had committed to pursuing. His workshops on self-defense and empowerment became popular community events that brought together students, parents, and educators around themes of mutual respect and personal safety. The criminal investigation that had been proceeding parallel to the school board proceedings resulted in federal charges against several individuals involved in the harassment network, including Brandon Williams, Kyle Martinez, and Derek Thompson. The scope of the prosecution extended beyond Riverside High to include participants from multiple schools throughout the region, revealing the interstate nature of the exploitation network that had been operating. Maya's story attracted attention from educational reform advocates throughout Ohio and neighboring states, leading to speaking engagements at conferences focused on creating safer school environments and supporting educators who faced harassment or intimidation. Her message consistently emphasized that real strength comes from standing up for principles, even when the personal costs seem overwhelming. The legal settlement negotiations that followed the board's vindication of Maya resulted in substantial financial compensation for the harassment she'd endured, but more importantly, they established precedents for protecting other educators who might face similar challenges in the future. The district's agreement to ongoing external monitoring of their anti-harassment efforts created accountability mechanisms that would ensure lasting change rather than temporary reform. 2 years after the hallway confrontation that had nearly destroyed her career, Maya stood before a packed auditorium at the Ohio State Education Association's annual conference, delivering the keynote address about resilience in education to an audience that included hundreds of teachers who'd faced their own challenges with difficult students, unsupportive administrators, or hostile communities. Strength isn't about avoiding conflict or accepting injustice to maintain peace, Maya told the assembled educators, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd survived systematic harassment and emerged stronger. Real strength is about knowing your worth, standing firm in your principles, and understanding that sometimes the most important lessons we teach have nothing to do with our subject matter and everything to do with character and courage. Her presentation included analysis of the systematic changes that had been implemented at Riverside High and throughout the Cedar Falls district, providing concrete examples of how individual acts of courage could catalyze institutional transformation that benefited entire communities. The audience's response was overwhelmingly positive, with many educators approaching her afterward to share their own stories of harassment and seek advice about addressing similar situations. In the audience, Tank Washington smiled as he watched his former student inspire others to find their own voices and courage in the face of institutional indifference or hostility. Beside him sat Rebecca Miller, who'd left Riverside High to join Tank's expanded educational consulting business, and Sarah Chen, who'd become a close friend and legal advisor for educators facing harassment or discrimination throughout the region. Maya's story had transcended her individual experience to become a symbol of hope for teachers and students who'd previously felt powerless against systematic intimidation and abuse. The hallway confrontation that had initially seemed likely to end her career had instead become the foundation for a movement that was changing how schools addressed harassment and supported those who stood up against it. The scholarship fund that had been established in Maya's honor provided financial support for students who'd been victims of harassment but lacked resources to pursue higher education. The fund's recipients included several young women who'd found the courage to report their own experiences after seeing Maya's willingness to defend herself and fight for justice through proper legal channels. Tank's Warriors Den had expanded to include satellite locations throughout Ohio, each offering self-defense training specifically designed for educators and students who'd experienced harassment or intimidation. The programs emphasized empowerment and confidence building, rather than aggression, creating communities of support for individuals who'd previously felt isolated and vulnerable. Maya's teaching career flourished in the supportive environment that had emerged from the systematic reforms implemented following her vindication. Her students consistently achieved exceptional results on standardized assessments, but more importantly, they developed critical thinking skills and personal confidence that prepared them for success in college and beyond. The annual anti-harassment conference that Maya helped organize drew participants from throughout the Midwest, creating networks of educators, students, and parents committed to creating safer, more respectful educational environments. The conference featured workshops on conflict resolution, bystander intervention, legal rights, and psychological recovery for harassment victims. Maya's relationship with her students had been transformed by their shared experience of systematic change and institutional reform. Many of the young women who'd found courage to speak up during the board meeting had become leaders in student government and community advocacy, using their voices to address other forms of inequality and injustice they encountered. The federal investigation that had grown out of the harassment network discovery resulted in congressional hearings about the role of social media platforms in facilitating exploitation of minors. Maya was invited to testify about the intersection of institutional failures and technological vulnerabilities that had enabled the systematic harassment she'd experienced. Her congressional testimony emphasized the importance of comprehensive approaches to preventing harassment that addressed both individual accountability and institutional culture change. Maya's recommendations for federal policy reform drew on her experience implementing successful prevention programs at Riverside High and other schools throughout the region. The book that Maya eventually wrote about her experience became a bestseller among educators and parents seeking to understand how systematic harassment networks operate and how communities can work together to prevent them. The book's success led to additional speaking opportunities and consulting contracts that allowed Maya to expand her impact beyond her individual classroom. Tank's role as Maya's mentor had evolved into a professional partnership focused on developing evidence-based approaches to violence prevention in educational settings. Their collaborative research was funded by federal grants and published in peer-reviewed journals, contributing to the academic literature on institutional responses to systematic harassment. The documentary film that was produced about Maya's story and its aftermath won several awards at film festivals focused on social justice and educational reform. The film's distribution through streaming platforms brought national attention to the issues of educator harassment and institutional accountability that had been central to Maya's experience. Maya's marriage to a fellow educator who shared her commitment to social justice created a partnership that strengthened both their professional and personal effectiveness in addressing inequality and injustice. Their combined expertise in different subject areas allowed them to develop interdisciplinary approaches to character education and conflict resolution. The master's degree program in educational leadership that Maya pursued during her sabbatical year included a thesis focusing on institutional responses to systematic harassment that drew heavily on her personal experience and professional observations. Her research contributed to policy recommendations that were adopted by school districts throughout Ohio and neighboring states. Maya's promotion to department chair reflected the respect and trust she'd earned from colleagues and administrators who'd witnessed her grace under pressure and commitment to institutional improvement. Her leadership style emphasized collaboration and empowerment, creating environments where other educators felt safe to report concerns and seek support for challenging situations. The mentorship program that Maya established for new teachers included specific training on recognizing and responding to harassment, drawing on lessons learned from her own experience, and the systematic changes that had been implemented throughout the district. The program's success led to its adoption by other school systems seeking to support vulnerable educators. Tank's retirement from active military service allowed him to devote full attention to his educational consulting work, which had expanded to include contracts with federal agencies and international organizations seeking expertise in violence prevention and institutional culture change. His partnership with Maya had become a model for effective collaboration between content experts and lived experience advocates. The annual scholarship banquet that honored Maya's contributions to educational reform and student empowerment drew attendees from throughout the educational community, including former students who credited her influence with inspiring their own careers in teaching, social work, and community advocacy. The event raised funds for continued expansion of harassment prevention programs. Maya's doctoral studies in educational psychology focused on the long-term impact of institutional culture change on student achievement and well-being. Her research methodology included longitudinal studies of students who'd experienced both the problematic environment that had existed before her confrontation with harassment and the reformed environment that had emerged afterward. The Policy Institute that Maya eventually established brought together researchers, practitioners, and advocates from multiple disciplines to develop comprehensive approaches to preventing systematic harassment in educational settings. The Institute's work influenced federal policy development and provided technical assistance to school districts implementing culture change initiatives. Maya's legacy extended far beyond her individual experience of harassment and vindication to encompass the systematic changes that had been catalyzed by her willingness to defend herself and fight for justice through proper legal channels. The young woman who'd driven north from Atlanta with dreams of inspiring students through literature had discovered that sometimes the most powerful teaching moments arise not from lesson plans and curricula, but from the courage to defend what's right when everything seems stacked against you. Her story continued to inspire educators, students, and parents who faced their own challenges with harassment and institutional indifference, providing evidence that individual acts of courage could catalyze systematic change that benefited entire communities. Maya Johnson had found her voice, and in doing so, she'd helped countless others find theirs as well. The ripple effects of Maya's confrontation with harassment continued expanding throughout her community and beyond, creating waves of positive change that would protect future generations of students and educators from the systematic intimidation and abuse she'd experienced. Her legacy would be measured not just in test scores and college acceptances, but in the countless individuals who learned that they didn't have to accept harassment and injustice as inevitable parts of their educational experience. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.